Literary Devices, Level F, Lesson 22. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify literal and figurative language in a text, identify point of view and how it influences characters and events in a text, explain the effect of imagery and sound devices in a text, explain the meaning of similes and metaphors in context, examine how the author's use of literary devices and language contributes to voice in a text. What you should know before doing this lesson. Figurative language appeals to the five senses and has a different meaning than the literal meaning of the words the author uses. Metaphors and similes are types of figurative language that compare unlike things. Literary devices that authors use include point of view, imagery, sound devices, metaphors, and similes for a particular effect or feeling in a text. Awesome words. In this section, we will spend some time on important academic words you need to know in order to understand the objectives of this lesson. You should review this part of the video as often as you need to remember the different types of literary devices used in reading and writing selections. Identify literal and figurative language in a text. Literal means used to express strong feelings while not being actually true. Figurative is representing by using creative use of words to express feelings. In other words, literal and figurative language is descriptive language that appeals to the senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Writers use these techniques to give different effects to their writing. Identify point of view and how it influences characters and events in a text. Point of view is the position from which a story is being told. Or in other words, first-person point of view is when the narrator of a story is a character in the story. The narrator uses the pronouns I, me, my to let the reader know what that character is thinking. The reader is in the narrator's head. Third-person point of view is when the narrator is not a character in the story. The reader is told about actions and behaviors of characters. The reader doesn't know what the character is thinking or feeling unless they verbally express themselves. Explained the effect of imagery and sound devices in a text. Devices is a turn of phrase intended to produce a particular effect in speech or literary work. Imagery is visually descriptive language. Onomatopoeia is a word from a sound associated with what is named. In other words, descriptive words an author uses to appeal to the reader through the five senses, usually visual. Imagery helps the reader experience the text. The tree bark was rough against her skin. That appeals to the sense of feel. The clouds were edged with pink and gold at sunset. That should appeal to your sense of sight. Onomatopoeia appeals to the sense of sound. Buzz of the bee, swish of the horse's tail, hoot of an owl. Explain the meaning of similes and metaphors in context. Simile is a figure of speech to compare one thing to another of a different kind, using like or as. Metaphor is figure of speech applied to an object which is not actually applicable. In other words, similes and metaphors are both used to compare two unlike objects in a descriptive way to appeal to a reader's senses. Similes use the words like or as in the comparison. Examples: brave like a lion, red as a rose, funny as a monkey. Metaphors compare by saying how an object is like another. Examples: snow is a white blanket. Calm water was a mirror. Long hair was a flowing golden river. Examine how the author's use of literary devices and language contributes to voice in a text. Voice expresses the narrator's or author's emotions, attitude, tone, and point of view through the use of literary devices. In other words, voice is the writer's style used to tell the story. If the story is intended to be funny, the author will use a humorous tone and describe situations in a funny way. Example: today my alarm clock went off at 6:30, screaming like an angry chicken. If the story is intended to be scary, the author will use words that give off feelings of darkness or uncertainty. Example: the country night is black as ink. The night is silent and still. So literary devices are used to make selections more descriptive and appealing to a reader. Writers want their words to be read. Using literary devices is the tool that helps writers produce selections that people want to read. Part 1, Introduction, Literary Devices. Follow along and listen as I read. Notice who is narrating each story and the voice or style of writing. Hero, as told in first person. After school, I walked down the street to the restaurant where my mother worked. I would sit and do my homework at the counter for about an hour while she finished her shift. Then she would walk me home. Mom always wanted to make sure I got home safely. One day, my homework was to write about my hero. I was dead tired from a long day at school and couldn't think of anything to write about. Sitting next to me was a regular customer, Mr. Eagleston. He was friendly, and it made me feel good whenever he sat nearby. He offered to help me. He said, "A hero is someone who helps people, who protects others and keeps them safe without asking for anything in return. Who is like that in your life?" I watched my mother working hard behind the counter. I thought about how, even when she was tired after a shift, she was always there for me and made sure I got home safely. Suddenly, I knew the hero I would write about. Now listen to hero as told in third person. After school, Keisha walked down the street to the restaurant where her mother worked. Keisha would sit and do her homework at the counter for about an hour while her mother finished her shift. Then the pair would walk home together. Keisha's mom always wanted to make sure Keisha got home safely. One day, Keisha's homework was to write about her hero. She was dead tired from a long day at school and couldn't think of anything to write about. Sitting next to her was a regular customer, Mr. Eagleston. He was friendly, and it made Keisha feel good whenever he sat nearby. He noticed Keisha seemed troubled and decided to help her. He said, A hero is someone who helps people, who protects others and keeps them safe without asking for anything in return. Who is like that in your life? Keisha watched her mother working hard behind the counter. She thought about how even when her mother was tired after a shift, she was always there and made sure Keisha got home safely. Suddenly, Keisha knew the hero she would write about. Stories are told from different points of view. The point of view affects what events are included and how they are described. Stories are told in first-person or third-person point of view. In first-person point of view, the narrator is a character in the story. In third-person point of view, the narrator is not a character in the story. Look at the highlighted pronouns in the first-person version of hero. The narrator uses the pronouns I, my, and me. This tells me that the narrator is a character in the story. The story is told from a first-person point of view. What does the narrator describe? Because the narrator uses the first-person point of view, she reveals details about what she alone thinks, sees, feels, and knows. Look at the highlighted pronouns in the third-person version of hero. The narrator refers to the character by name and uses the pronouns her and she. Is the narrator a character in the story? No. The story is told from a third-person point of view. In the third-person point of view, a narrator can reveal the feelings and thoughts of more than one character. Authors use different kinds of literary devices or techniques to give different effects to their writing. Figurative language is language that has a different meaning than its literal meaning. It appeals to the senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Some types of figurative language you will learn about are imagery, sound devices, metaphors, and similes. Part 2, Practice 1, Identify imagery and sound devices. Figurative language is a literary device that can appeal to any of the 5 senses: taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight. Imagery and sound devices are kinds of figurative language. Take a look at Wagon in the Rain. Listen and follow along as I read. Travel by wagon was hot and slow. The sun blazed in the sky, orange and low. Then a blanket of clouds rolled over the sun. The clouds moved in, the rain had begun. The horse picked up the pace, clippity-clop, as the rain splashed down, plippity-plop. I stuck out my hand and felt the cool rain as our wagon clattered and bumped down the lane. Imagery helps readers to picture or feel what is happening. Look at the first stanza. The words, "The sun blazed in the sky," help me picture that it is hot. In the second stanza, what does the image of a blanket of clouds help you picture? Sound devices include rhyme and onomatopoeia. Rhyme is when the ending sound of 2 words is the same. Look at the second stanza. What rhymes with sun? Begun. When a word sounds like the actual sound that the word describes, it is called onomatopoeia. The word clippity-clop is used to describe the sound of horses' hooves in the third stanza. What is another example of onomatopoeia in the third stanza? Plippity-plop. What does it describe? The sound of raindrops landing on the ground. Look at stanza 4. Can you find an example of imagery? Cool rain. Can you find an example of rhyme? Rain and lane. Can you find an example of onomatopoeia? Clattered. Part 3, Practice 2, Explain metaphors and similes in context. Metaphors and similes are types of figurative language. Both metaphors and similes compare unlike things to help describe something. Let's read City Morning. A city in the morning is a hive of activity. People move about like busy bees. Some days the cars zip and zoom up and down the busy streets like lightning. But on days when there is a traffic jam, they move as slowly as snails. The streets are a parking lot. Look at the first sentence again. A city in the morning is a hive of activity. This is a metaphor. It compares a city to a hive, a beehive. Read the second sentence again. People move about like busy bees. This is a simile. Like a metaphor, it compares two unlike things, but a simile uses the words like or as. What do the metaphor and simile tell you about the city? It is as busy as a hive of bees. Let's read the third sentence. Some days the cars zip and zoom up and down the busy streets like lightning. What does the simile compare cars to in this sentence? Lightning. What does this tell you about the cars? They are moving fast. Let's read the last two sentences. But on days when there is a traffic jam, they move as slowly as snails. The streets are a parking lot. What moves as slowly as snails? Cars. What kind of figurative language is this? It's a simile. What does the metaphor in the last sentence compare? Streets and a parking lot. What do the metaphor and simile in these sentences tell you about the cars? They are going very slowly. Now let's read Country Night. Can you identify any similes or metaphors? Follow along. The country night is black as ink. The only lights are stars that twinkle like diamonds in the dark sky. The night is silent and still. Then suddenly the call of a screech owl breaks the quiet. Its call is a siren piercing through the evening peace. Did you find any similes? How about metaphor? Part 4, Practice 3. Examine how literary devices affect voice. Country Night and Wagon in the Rain both describe a country setting, but Country Night uses metaphor and simile, which gives that selection a scarier feeling. Dark night, piercing screech. Wagon in the Rain, on the other hand, uses sound devices, rhyme, and onomatopoeia to give a more casual or light-hearted voice. Sun blazed, orange and low, blankets of clouds, clippity-clop, plippity-plop, felt the cool rain. Voice is the unique style of a piece of writing. Remember when we read the story Hero from two different points of view? Point of view affects voice. The first-person point of view has a very personal voice because the narrator is a character in the story, and you know her thoughts and feelings. Is the same story from the third-person point of view more or less personal? It would be less personal because the reader is not directly inside the narrator's thoughts and feelings. Let's read Late Again and look for literary devices in this selection. Late again. I try not to be late, but it feels as if something always goes wrong. Today my alarm clock went off at 6:30, screaming like an angry chicken. I hit the snooze button. Only I didn't hit the snooze button. I turned it off and overslept by half an hour. I threw my clothes on and stomped into the kitchen. I snapped angrily at my sister when she got in my way. Eli, you're a bear when you've overslept, she complained. I ran out the door, and of course it was raining. It was the icy cold kind. Miserable. At school, I tried to slip into class, but my wet shoes squeak, squeak, squeaked. Late again, they said. So what literary devices do we see in Late Again? We see first-person point of view with the pronouns I. We see a simile describing the alarm clock screaming like an angry chicken. There is a metaphor when his sister says, "You're a bear." We have imagery, the icy cold rain, and onomatopoeia describing the sounds of his wet shoes. Squeak, squeak, squeaked. Let's review the concepts from this lesson. Literary devices are techniques that writers use to give different effects to their writing. Figurative language appeals to the five senses and has a different meaning than the literal words. Figurative language includes imagery, sound devices, metaphors, and similes. Point of view affects the voice of a literary selection.